Hello again from my front porch. It is January 27th and I want to commemorate a very special anniversary today. Now, 85 years ago, 1933 in Detroit, Michigan, a radio show premiered. Well, technically, the official premiere isn't until January 30th or 31st, depending on which authors you read, but there is indication that there were some dry runs, some sample starts before they officially launched it and did the big, hey, it's coming out. And from the research I've done, it seems to indicate that it was just a few days before that, which would put it here on the 27th. So I'm saying that on the 27th of January, 1933 is when the Lone Ranger first hit the airwaves. Now, again, officially, it's January 30th, 31st. Doesn't matter. Still, point is, this here, January, the Lone Ranger turns 85 years old. And he looks pretty good. But I love the Lone Ranger. I love the radio show. I love the TV show. I love the books. I love most of the movies. There have been the two most recent movies, the two most modern ones. Not a big fan. There was one called The Legend of the Lone Ranger that was made back in the 80s that it had some good qualities, but in general it just fell flat. One of the big reasons it fell flat, though, was because the producers of the movie, in order to prevent any confusion for people, they legally prevented Clayton Moore from going around dressed as the Lone Ranger. Now, you may remember Clayton Moore as being the actor who played the Lone Ranger in the 1950s television show and the couple of actual motion picture movies that were filmed based of that as well. And for a lot of people, when you think of the Lone Ranger, Clayton Moore as the Lone Ranger and Jay Silverheels as Tonto, those are the individuals that you tend to come to mind with. That's visually who we tend to see. But so the makers of that movie back in the 80s thought that they needed to not have Clayton Moore running around, because he was still doing public appearances and rodeos and all this kind of stuff, dressed up as the Lone Ranger. I mean, he really embodied the role, and he didn't just do it as a money-making thing. He actually embraced it. He saw it as a role model, and his heart and his passion was in doing that. It devastated him when the studio said you can't keep doing that, and he fought it legally, and they didn't do it. And then there was this big deal about how Foster Grant, the sunglasses people, Foster Grant made him a custom pair of sunglasses that were shaped like the Lone Ranger's mask. So he wasn't wearing the Lone Ranger's mask, he was wearing sunglasses. So that was kind of funny. And then I remember there was an episode of the show Real People, for those ancient like myself who remember that. There was an episode of Real People where they talked about that whole legal thing, and they had a whole show about it. And then they introduced him. They had him come out, and they introduced it. I still vividly remember it by saying, "And ladies and gentlemen, we present to you now the one, the only, the Lone Ranger." And the wall thing went up, and he stepped out in a blue cowboy suit, not the blue Lone Ranger outfit, but a blue Western suit, wearing a white hat and those Foster Grant sunglasses, and the audience erupted. Immediate standing ovation. Everybody just loved him. And it was because of the fallout, partly because the fallout from making the bad choice of taking his mask away, that movie in the 80s bombed. And that also bombed because it wasn't really a very good movie. Speaking of not very good movies, Disney, of course, recently tried to do it as well, with Johnny Depp playing Tonto. And again, I'm a big Lone Ranger fan, so I was excited to go see it. And then I saw it, and I was not so excited about it. And I will give you this little handy tip. This is what works for me. When you see the Lone Ranger is on TV, when you see it, when you see in your TV guide thing that it's on, wait until it's the last 30 minutes of the show, of the movie. Wait for the last 30 minutes of the movie and then start watching. If you start watching with only 30 minutes left to go in the movie, you will enjoy the movie. You can ignore everything else that happens before that. Trust me. The movie doesn't get good until you first hear the Lone Ranger's theme, and that doesn't come until that last 30 minutes of the movie. So anyway, that's again, big Lone Ranger fan. I've been a fan. But like I said, this is the 85th anniversary of the Lone Rangers radio program, and I have a whole bunch of. Look at this cassette tape. This is only part of it. I mean, I've got cassettes downstairs. I got record albums downstairs. But even though this is the cassette tapes of the old radio program, notice on the cover it's Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels, who are not the radio Lone Rangers. In fact, there were at least 8 radio Lone Rangers, 8 different actors to play that role. The longest one was a guy named Brace Beamer, who, similar to Clayton Moore, took the role very seriously. And he maintained, in his personal life, he maintained a lifestyle that would not cause any diminishment of the Lone Ranger, that would not reflect bad on the Lone Ranger. Brace, big, strapping, muscular, big guy. He fit the body role you would expect, but he also had the voice to carry the role. However, when you listen to both the radio show and even the TV show, the 50s TV show and the movies they did, you know when they do the Lone Ranger theme, and you'd hear as part of the Lone Ranger theme that at the end, where you'd hear the Lone Ranger yell, "Hi-yo, Silver, away!" That was not Brace Beamer. That was a guy named Earl Geiser. I almost blanked on his first name just right there on the spot. Earl Grazer. Earl Grazer was probably one of the finest vocal actors to portray the Lone Ranger. Unfortunately, he died in a car accident, and so they were not able. Obviously, he couldn't keep doing it. But he did some of those pieces like that so well, they kept the recordings. They kept that recording, and they kept recycling Earl Grazer to do it. Little funny side note about him though, unlike Brace Beamer, Earl Grazer did not fit the physical model, role model. Earl Grazer was a scrawny little wimpy looking fella, and there's a really funny story of him going to a big black tie event thing, back in the day, would have probably been the late 30s, early 40s. And he goes to this big black tie event, and they have the big band playing, and all this kind of celebrities and rich people and stuff. And at this event, they decide to have a contest: who can sound the most like the Lone Ranger. Okay, so they're supposed to get up there and do the "Hi-yo, Silver, away!" See who could do it the most like the Lone Ranger. And Earl did not want to enter the contest because it's not fair. I am the voice of the Lone Ranger. But his table mates like, do it. It'd be fun. He did it. He did not win. He did not win, and you know why he didn't win. It's because people weren't just closing their eyes and hearing the voice like was on radio. Because there were no pictures, there was no photograph. In fact, before Brace Beamer actually took on the role of the Lone Ranger on the show, Brace served as an announcer on the show. He also served as the Lone Ranger for public appearances because he fit the big strapping. Earl Grazer, during his time of being the Lone Ranger on the radio, was never seen in public as the Lone Ranger because, again, it would ruin the image, the imagination that's being created. So here's poor Earl Grazer entering contest to who could sound the most like the Lone Ranger. He is the Lone Ranger, and he's not picked because visually people couldn't. No matter how much his voice sounded like it, visually you couldn't disconnect. It's like, that's not the Lone Ranger, and so somebody else won. Anyway, that's just kind of fun little Lone Ranger trivia. So I've got all these old radio programs, the lots of copies of the old radio programs. But the Lone Ranger caught on, became a big deal, as we all know. Fran Stryker, who wrote the scripts for the Lone Ranger on the radio program there when it was in broadcasting out of Detroit, he also wrote a whole series of Lone Ranger books, which I'm happy to say I have the whole series downstairs. And so here's the very first one, the very first of the Lone Ranger books. This one I believe is dated 1936, if I'm not mistaken. Let me see here. Yep, copyright 1936 for the very first one. It's just called The Lone Ranger. And then, of course, there's others that came after that. The Lone Ranger became a marketing cash cow. There was all kinds of bread products and Cheerios and just about anything you can think of. Everybody wanted stuff with the Lone Ranger because the Lone Ranger was an immediate hit, just caught on so big. And so the Lone Ranger went on from there, and when movies and TV were coming out, but movies initially, when you used to go to a movie, you didn't just go and watch the movie. Now we go to the movie theater, and if you get there early, you watch the not just the preview of coming attractions, but a lot of theaters have this little entertainment thing that you can watch, where it shows behind the scenes of stuff, maybe some interviews, maybe some what other interesting bits of Hollywood information. But and so it's kind of like what used to be, again, back in the day, where people would go to a movie, but before the movie, there would be other stuff. There'd be newsreels about what's going on in the world, especially when war was happening. There would be cartoons. There would be serials, which would be where you take one story and you chop it up into like 6 or 10, 12 pieces, bite-sized pieces, and you'd show a piece of it each week, for example. And so that was a way for the movie theater people to get you to keep coming back to watch the same movies over and over, or just to simply keep coming back to watch movies in general, because you keep wanting to see the next chapter in this serial. And the Lone Ranger was no different. In fact, I've got video here of this is the second one. I don't have video of the first one. Let's see, I was looking, I don't remember the exact year that this one came out. But this is called The Lone Ranger Rides Again, and this does not feature Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels. There are other individuals playing the Lone Ranger and Tonto here. And in this one, they also have a Mexican companion, which I think is interesting. Somebody felt the need just to add that. But Robert Livingston plays the Lone Ranger. Chief Thundercloud plays Tonto, and then there's a guy named Duncan Ronaldo who plays this the Mexican counterpart. And so, interesting, it says, I got to read you a little blurb here. It says, this rare cereal was discovered in Mexico. Apparently they kept it because, anyway, was discovered in Mexico and is the only print known to exist. It is the complete 15-chapter serial, with the exception of each chapter's beginning and ending credits removed. The dialogue is in the original English with Spanish subtitles. But anyway, I just think that's interesting, because in this one, this is the Masked Rider's second screen appearance. The Lone Ranger, his Indian companion Tonto, and his Mexican companion join a wagon train to stop ruthless cattlemen threatening a band of settlers. Pretty standard storyline for a lot of westerns, but anyway. So that's a 15-chapter serial that you would go and you'd see all of those before the movie. But then that wasn't good enough. Of course, then in the 1950s, we all know, Clayton Moore and Jay Silverheels, they get a TV show, the Lone Ranger, and we've all seen that. It was on TV for a long, and then it even went into reruns for a while. Now there was one season where Clayton Moore did not play the Lone Ranger. There was some contractual dispute stuff, and another actor named John Hurt stepped in and took over that role. Or John Hart, sorry, John Hurt, a whole different actor. John Hart stepped in and took over that role for one season, but people didn't really care for it too much. And then Clayton Moore was brought back because he was definitely by far the more popular one in it, and of course still that's who we know today. In fact, so popular on TV was the Lone Ranger that they had two major motion pictures, one called The Lone Ranger and the other one called The Lone Ranger and the Lost City of Gold, which I have the DVD of here. And in fact, for the Lone Ranger movie, that's where they had the introduction that many of us are aware of. In fact, they would reuse it a lot of times, because they would take the old 1950s TV episodes and they would stitch like 4 of them together into like a 2-hour thing that they would broadcast on TV. And then in front of that, they would take the introduction from the Lone Ranger movie that was made and they drop it on the front. That's the one that has that whole little song about the 6 Texas Rangers, hi-yo, hi-yo, rode in the sun, hi-yo, hi-yo, 6 men of justice rode into an ambush and death for all but one. One lone survivor, hi-yo, hi-yo, lay on the trail, hi-yo, hi-yo, found there by Tonto, the brave Indian Tonto, he lived to tell the tale. Hi-yo, silver, away, hi-yo, silver, away. His wounds quickly mended, hi-yo, and then in the night, hi-yo, 6 graves were put there to hide from the outlaws that one man lived to fight. He chose silver bullets, hi-yo, the sign of his name, hi-yo, a mask to disguise him, a great silver stallion, and thus began his fame. Hi-yo, silver, away, hi-yo, silver, away. The Lone Ranger is his name. I can't believe I remembered all the words to that. But speaking of which, the whole story about the Lone Ranger, how he comes to be, is he gets ambushed. He's riding with his brother and other Texas Rangers, and they get ambushed in a place called Bryant's Gap, and by the Butch Cavendish gang. And Butch Cavendish thinks they're all dead. Tonto, of course, comes along and finds the Lone Ranger wounded. And of course, there are variations to the story that talk about the allege that many years prior, when they were boys, that young Lone Ranger John Reed is actually his real name, that he had helped little Tonto, saved his life in something, and so it's ever since. And so now it's fate that Tonto finds John wounded and returns the favor of helping him back, and that whole kimosabi thing, the bonding of the friendship. But on the radio program, what a lot of people don't know, because that's the whole crux of the story. That's how he begins. Butch Cavendish ambushes, kills everybody. What a lot of people don't know is that 20 years after the show was broadcast, so in 1953, the radio show was still going, still on. 20th anniversary episode of The Lone Ranger on radio, the Lone Ranger finally caught Butch Cavendish. Finally caught up with him. And then I hate to, I don't think this will count as a spoiler, because, again, this is now 65 years ago. If you haven't heard it by now, it's your own fault. But there's a big battle between the Lone Ranger and Butch Cavendish on the top edge, from where Butch's gang ambushed the Lone Ranger 20 years before. But they're in this big fight up on the ledge, and Cavendish lunges at the Lone Ranger. He lifts his feet up trying to block the lunging, and Cavendish actually winds up getting flung off the ledge and falls to his death in the canyon. But he doesn't die immediately. The Lone Ranger goes down, and Cavendish is laying there, and he's lamenting. He can't believe that his entire gang was crushed by one Lone Ranger. And then the Lone Ranger takes off his mask, and it's better than that. Look at me. He's like, no, you're dead. I saw you die. And it's a great dialogue, great melodramatic dialogue, but it's radio. And so the best part then being when Cavendish, when John Reed says to him, I wanted you to know who it was that broke you, that broke your gang. And Cavendish says, I wish I would have died not knowing it. Oh. Great dialogue. But anyway, so then at that point they actually removed the fake grave, the empty one. They removed it, smoothed over the dirt and stuff, because it was no longer necessary for him to hide in that sense. But he was going to continue fighting for truth and justice as the Lone Ranger. But he just wasn't going to. He didn't need to pull off the facade that he had died in that canyon. So that's an interesting little twist to the story. But then, we got the movies, the TV shows, everything going on, and even after the Lone Ranger went off the air, it didn't die. There was also an animated Lone Ranger that was on that didn't last very long, and that's okay, because it got a little freaky, a little weird, like Lone Ranger battling aliens and all kinds of weird, odd little quirky stuff like that. But it was cartoons. It's Saturday morning cartoon stuff. But along that same time frame, then we started to also see there'd be things like action figures. See my action figure, my Lone Ranger and Silver. I also have my Lone Ranger. I also have Tonto and Scout downstairs, and I have Butch Cavendish and his horse Smoke. I have all of those. All of these downstairs as well. I have a whole bunch of stuff down. I just wasn't going to haul it all up here. One thing that I really am most proud of is the Lone Ranger was also used beyond just entertainment and for making money purposes. He was used to help raise money in the war effort too. So like here, for example, I have this I'm very pleased with it. It's an actual authentic, it's in a little laminated card thing, but this is a U.S. Savings Bond Peace Patrol from the Treasury Department. And notice it's blank, it's in mint condition. So it's really awesome. But notice the Lone Ranger right there. See, he was the spokesperson to help raise money. And it says in the back here, Peace Patrol members, creed and pledge. I believe that all men are created equal and that everyone has within himself the power to help make this a better world. In being prepared physically, mentally, and morally to stand up for that which is right. I pledge to learn because knowledge and understanding will help keep peace in the world, and to save because buying United States savings stamps and bonds will help to keep our country strong. So there you go. See, the Lone Ranger Peace Patrol pledge. But again, it's all part of selling treasury bonds. But because again, the Lone Ranger had that kind of clout and influence. So Lone Ranger still to this day, I can sit and listen to the old radio shows, and I love them. I just love old radio shows in general, but the Lone Ranger ones especially I really enjoy, and reading, still going back every once in a while, read through the books, and unfortunately I don't really have a space to set out a display of all of my stuff, so it's all kind of crammed on a shelf in my office, which is a little bit sad, but I know it's there. Now, another little interesting tidbit that you may not all be aware of is that there is the same radio station in Detroit. They launched another successful radio show called The Green Hornet, which was there, and it was set in, at that point, contemporary Detroit, modern day Detroit, and so that it was still a masked crime fighter and his sidekick fighting the bad guys, but it wasn't in the Old West like the Lone Ranger. It was set in contemporary time for when the show was done. But they didn't just take the template and revise it, update it. The main character of the Green Hornet, Britt Reed, is actually a great nephew of the Lone Ranger. Because the Lone Ranger, while he never got married, he had his brother who died at Bryan's Gap, and his brother had a wife and a son. His son, the son's name was Dan Reed. And we do get to meet Dan Reed on the radio show. He shows up on the TV show episodes. So, we've all met Dan Reed. Well, Dan Reed apparently went on, got married, and had a son named Britt Reed. And Britt Reed is the Green Hornet. So apparently masked crime fighting flowed in the family. So I enjoy listening to Green Hornet stuff too. I don't have near as much of that, but I do enjoy some of that too. All right, well, I'm gonna wrap it up. But thank you for joining me on my little tribute to the Masked Man, the Green Hornet. And so I guess I will leave you. I will leave you with the way that the radio show and the old classic TV show would begin as well. And that's with the well, you'll know it when you hear it. So, you ready? A fiery horse with the speed of light, a cloud of dust, and a hearty hi-yo silver, the Lone Ranger. I just love doing that. I mean, there's more to it, but I won't get into all of it. But anyway, this is great. I love the Lone Ranger. I love just embracing it some. And so now, if you made it all the way to the end of this, you've endured it with me as well. All right. With that, I will see you next time. From my front porch. Hi-yo, Silver! Away!